The Travels of John de Mandeville, Chetham's manuscript number A4107. 300 copies of Mandeville's travels survive in libraries around the world, as opposed to just 70 copies of Marco Polo's, showing something of the popularity of this curious travel account. The story goes that an expatriate English knight named John Mandeville recalled his journey to the Holy Land in the 1360s. He offered pilgrims alternative routes to Jerusalem and described what they might see along the way. He travelled through Byzantium and made it to the Holy City before venturing off into the Orient. He commented on the people he witnessed around the world, the Jews of the Rhineland, the Christians of Constantinople, and the grotesque monsters he encountered beyond the Middle East. Mandeville, the man, has proved elusive. Jackson suggested that if he was in Liège, as he claimed, and wrote of peace between England and France, he must have been writing after the Treaty of Brittany in 1360, meaning that if his claim to have left England 33 years earlier was true, it put him uncomfortably close to a Richard Mandeville who was wanted for the murder of Edward III, Earl of Ulster. Less inglorious claims had been made by Seymour, who concluded that Mandeville was a pseudonym for a French monk, writing from pilgrim narratives on hand in the monastery's book collection. 1371 is the earliest surviving Mandeville, and is currently held in Paris. Letts studied it at length, and noted the manuscript's greater length, richer detail and romantic language than the other, and presumably later copies existent in the manuscript canon. Transmission of the text through time, its original edition, and later variations need not be considered here, but the methodology of new philology will be employed later. The Chetham's copy of the Travels of John de Mandeville is one example of the later manuscript versions, and reveals some important issues of the book's original audience, the literary industry that produced it, and the book's place in English popular works of the high medieval period. The manuscript survives in a later binding of the 19th century, which carries the stamp of the Manchester Library on its front cover. From the first page of the manuscript, a lot can be discerned of the book's production. Production. At first glance, the manuscript is a rather untidy-looking creation. The text is presented in 2 columns in black ink with red initials, underlining and rubrication. The letters formed in the main text are presented in a cursive English hand, and the language is dialect English. The script demonstrates features common with hybrid cursive Anglicana, suggesting that a date around 1400 is most likely. A closer analysis of the black script shows that where the scribe has chosen to use whole words rather than abbreviations, the text fails to adhere comfortably to the margins and lines designed to organize the written words. In terms of information arrangement, rubrics are preferred to chapters, and the only numeration was added in later centuries. The text appears to have been produced by 2 scribes, one performing the role of supervisor and proofreader, as well as rubricator and illuminator. Where black text is crossed out in red ink, you can imagine the rubricator correcting their understudy, handing them back the parchment and demanding that the error be addressed. Their relationship is made more complex by the presence of guide letters associated with the red initials throughout the text. Where the initial F is used, a faint guide letter F can be seen beneath the red ink. Overall, though, it would seem safe to conclude that the rubricator was the brains of their particular outfit, as the red hand almost always adapts better to flaws in the parchment material. Where the parchment was torn, or had holes which obstructed the line of text, the red script adapted to it with ease. Letters retained their size and spacing, and maintained their overall legibility, whereas black letters often fell down the holes, or were squashed awkwardly around them on a second or third attempt. By the end of the manuscript, gaps appear in the columns, and the red ink hand was no longer present. Had the rubricator given it up as a bad job? Had the book's patron run out of cash? It would be difficult to say for certain why the red hand disappears from the page, but it shows how the book was produced collaboratively by 2 different craftsmen. The production of the Mandeville manuscript presents important characteristics of the book-producing industry in England in the late medieval period. Parkes surveyed the changing nature of book production and explained important motives of change in the high medieval period. Whereas monasteries once controlled the means and the manpower behind written language up to the Norman conquest, secular scribes were the mainstay of England's blossoming book culture by the late Plantagenet era. As Hellinger and Trapp demonstrated in the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, with much wider literacy amongst the laity came greater demand for popular works of fiction. As Moseley discovered, popular fiction in England often thrived and survived beyond the threshold between handwritten manuscript and printed book, because manuscript production had already adapted to wider readership, changing its genres with exciting new topics. As the Cambridge History explains, by wresting book production away from the monastic monopoly, the new regime in England effectively opened the door to lay scribes, more sensitive to demands of the literate lay market, who sought works in the vernacular in forms that were once accessible and engaging. The Mandeville demonstrates this process at work, but in doing so raises important questions about the book's purpose and its readership's engagement with it. Patronage. Luckily, a number of the book's former owners were careless enough to write a number of comments on the parchment and ink, meaning that their engagement with the text has been preserved. A high concentration of marginal notes appear in the manuscript around chapters concerning specific topics. This marginal note, in a cursive English hand, reads, "Priests are married, and common bread are used in this town." A small hand sketch is present, suggesting that this reader attempted to highlight a specific passage of text and intended to return to the reference at a later time. This process is repeated frequently across the next pages. This marginal note, in the same hand as before, reads "simony," and the same hand device is visible in association with it. So here, in two examples, is evidence that one reader was engaging with the manuscript, noting down a passage of particular interest to their concern, and highlighting it for easier reference later. That both notes relate to liturgical and episcopal issues might suggest that it was read by someone with an interest in Christian religious observation, the Church as an institution, and the varying practices in the Byzantine Church in particular. Further on, the marginal note here reads, "The Patriarch of Constantinople would not obey Rome." Similar to the previous examples of marginal notation, this reader has highlighted the relevant passage with a hand sketch for easier reference, and noted the text contents in the marginal space. So it would seem plausible based on these three examples that one reader was mining the text for information, taking the fictional text as factual, and retrieving information from it in the process. A fourth note shows even deeper engagement with the text. This marginal note reads, "I doubt this," suggesting that the reader was not simply accepting the contents of the text as integral and accurate. Instead, this note shows a reader beginning to challenge the text's assertions, wondering if the author's depiction of a foreign church was entirely accurate. One final sample of the readership's engagement with the manuscript shows how this process worked. This page, containing the binding beyond the final pages of the text, are included as flyleaves, with lines drawn to provide readers with a space for note-making. One of the identifiable different hands here lists place names: Stafford, Babylon, Jordan. It suggests that the reader was recalling the journey taken by the voice of the prose, listing places that have featured en route from England to the Orient. Manuscripts in the late 14th and early 15th centuries were no longer being produced as unique commissions for wealthy patrons. As Thomson explained, while books were still expensive and time-consuming to produce, centres of book production containing professional lay scribes were common. The original patron of the book would have had an input into its final realisation as a manuscript, and while margins are found frequently across books from this period, note spaces were a luxury considering the finite and expensive parchment material. The costly parchment was effectively given up to the final pages, with no text occupying the writing space. Had the patron intended to make extensive notes, as they and others did later on, the inclusion of blank note sheets can be resolved. The leaves appear to be original, and display the same patterns of damp damage visible at the corresponding first pages at the start of the manuscript. Besides the notes at the end of the book, the marginal note reveals something particularly medieval about literacy. In Carruthers' authoritative work on medieval book culture, it was demonstrated that books were not insulated artifacts to be read but never touched. Margins could act as a status symbol, a display of wealth on the part of the owner, who willingly gave up more money for more parchment. However, they were provided on the understanding that texts were accessible, even alterable, in a way that 21st century texts are not. Scribes, binders and booksellers accepted that their products would be added to, amended, or corrected by the actively literate readership, who could often write as well as read in this period. Significance. The Travels of John de Mandeville raises issues of late medieval book culture, which other historians have attempted to tackle. Lester and Seymour placed the manuscript in the fourth subgroup of defective English John Mandevilles, produced after 1360 from a French manuscript original. As a fourth generation, the defective Mandevilles were shorter and lacked the detail of their counterparts on the continent, and revealed how over relatively little time and space manuscripts could change radically. Of the book in English society, Howard suggests that the defects visible in the manuscript culture reflected the reformist interests of English readers in the 1400s, focusing on the religious rather than the fictitious aspects of the original French text. This contradicted an early assertion made by Halliwell, who produced hand lists on the manuscripts of the Chetham's library. It was suggested in the hand list that the manuscript was translated directly from the French original into English, based on the final page, which contains an anomalous second script which reads translated from French to English. It'd be difficult to conclude whether this represented a true indicator of the text's recent French origin, and can just as easily be a palimpsest, where an older parchment was reused for a later text. The real clue to the manuscript's historical significance comes in a marginal note early on in the text. At the top of the page, in the same cursive hand seen in the other marginal notes, is the name Gerard Lee. Now, if this was written as a stamp of ownership by one Gerard Lee, the notes they made throughout the chapters on Byzantium come into sharper focus. Gerard Lee went on to write The Ascent of Arms, published in 1568 as a printed book in London. Cooper suggested that the work became the most popular English book on heraldry in the 16th century, accounting for the high numbers of copies still in existence. Throughout the text, a reference to other works of literature, both fictional and non. Chaucer is mentioned, along with quotes from Froissart, and references to characters in Bede's ecclesiastical history. Safe to say, then, that Gerard Lee was very well read. Amongst his library at one stage was MS A4107, if the signature on folio 2 recto was a mark of ownership. In The Ascent of Arms, a curious foreign alphabet is included, as the two fictional knights share their experience of far-off distant lands they've witnessed while on crusade. As Seymour demonstrated, the defective mandibles in England generally do not contain the foreign alphabets in the original French manuscripts, but the Chetham's version does. Therefore, Lee possessed an unusual version of Mandeville, and included one of its unique characteristics in his own later work. This suggests, then, that the true significance of the manuscript is its influence on one of the greater popular works of heraldry in the 16th century. Despite its flaws, the omissions, corrections, and generally poor appearance, one reader engaged with it, was inspired by something he'd seen in it, and wrote his own book, taking at least one thing from it. Like Geoffrey Chaucer, Walter Raleigh, and Christopher Columbus, Gerard Lee may have been influenced, at least in passing, by his copy of John de Mandeville's travels. Books did not exist in isolation, preserved words on finite pages, once written and frozen in time. Instead, as writers like Bennett, Carruthers, and others have shown, the manuscript was part of a rich, interactive, and dynamic book culture in late medieval England. This manuscript suggests that, like the Canterbury Tales, the travels of John de Mandeville should be considered important and influential, living on through other writing, awakening the imagination of artists over a century later.